Hey there, everyone. This is Jonathan Barkan from Mutiny Pictures, and I'm here with Mike Schiff. Is that correct?
Yep, that's it.
Yep. From the history of metal and horror. This is a topic that I'm so excited to be chatting with you about. One, as a metalhead, and two, as a huge horror fan. This is the meeting of two amazing worlds that I can't wait to chat about this. So to dive right into it, I just want to start and ask, where did this idea come from? Where did you get the inspiration to connect these two worlds that definitely have an overlap, but that, it hasn't necessarily been explored too deeply, at least in documentary form?
So some years back, Kirk Hammett put on his Fear Festival convention, and my friend and producer on the film, Robert Lucas, he's friends with Kirk, and he was brought on board to kind of help do some work at the festival the convention, and he brought me on board to help do some photography and some video and things like that. So it was an awesome weekend. We had a lot of fun. It was just like an amazing experience being fans of both metal and horror, to be in this world that Kirk kind of put together at this convention that really encapsulated both genres perfectly. And having full access, backstage, green room, everything. Like, I wasn't just there as like a fan, but I was kind of participating in sort of this whole event,
Yeah.
and it was really amazing. It was absolutely fantastic. Met so many great people, and afterwards, I just spoke to Rob and I said, "Hey, has there ever been a documentary created on, you know, why metal and horror kind of work so well together? Why is it that so many fans of horror are fans of horror are metal fans and vice versa?" And he said, "No, there really hasn't been anything like that." So I said, "Maybe it's time to do something." So I started putting together some ideas. I put together a list of a bunch of people that I'd like to approach. Rob's very well connected in the horror industry. He knows pretty much everybody that attends all the conventions and everything. So he was able to help get a lot of people sort of on the roster to interview. And I also knew a few people. I already knew Chris Jericho prior to that. Him and
Mhm.
I shot and co-directed the Sandpaper video that Fozzy did some years back. So I already kind of knew him. So I reached out to him directly and asked him if he'd be interested in being interviewed for this. So he was the first interview, and then it kind of kept moving on from there. And yeah, that we just kept interviewing for a couple of years after that, and we got a pretty good group of characters.
Yeah, no, I mean, anyone who loves metal and or horror is going to see faces that they recognize in here. I mean, as you said, you've got Kirk Hammett from Metallica. You've also got Dave Mustaine from Megadeth. You've got Scott Ian from Anthrax, and then from the horror side, you have people that are just beloved. You have Gunnar Hansen from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You've got Sid Haig from Rob Zombie's films. And what was it like to be able to go to these people and to talk to them about both horror and metal? You've got the metal fans, you get to talk about horror. You've got the horror heads, and you get to talk about metal. What was it like to discuss with them these topics that are connected but not exactly directly related to what they do?
It was interesting because all the metal stars that we interviewed, all they're easily all horror fans. Like, that's without question. The horror guys, what was interesting about them is that, especially the older guys who've been in the business for a long time, they're not necessarily metal fans. All of them.
Yeah.
I had a few of them say, I'm not really that big into metal. You'd have to talk to my son about that, or whatever it was. Um, so and a couple of them were a little hesitant to begin with. They're like, well, I don't know, why are we really doing this, and stuff. And I said, well, look, trust me, once we get into a conversation, things are going to start coming out. And things, they did have opinions, on why metal and horror work so well together. A few of them have worked with horror stars before. You take Doug Bradley. He's not really a big metalhead. He doesn't listen to a lot of metal, but he worked with Cradle of Filth, some years
Yep.
back, and he knew Marilyn Manson. And I mean, there's like uh, a lot of the metal guys in the past would kind of reach out to the horror guys because they were fans and they try to build some sort of connection. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the horror stars, even though they're not really metal fans, they have relationships with metal stars as well. So yeah, so that was pretty interesting.
Can you expand upon that a little more? Because as you say this, it makes sense in my mind. There is this almost this weird sense of stardom as these metal fans, these metal heads, they look to these horror actors. And if we're being completely honest, someone like Kirk Hammett has touched far more lives, and has had and is theoretically, in the grand scheme of things, a bigger name than someone, say, like Doug Bradley. But for people like myself, we see Doug Bradley and we're like, oh my God, that's Pinhead. Like, this is so amazing. It's so cool. And for you looking at that and talking with these people, what was it like seeing these huge metal stars in a weird way be fans themselves?
Um, what was cool about it is that when they're telling old stories about when they were kids, kind of growing up on this stuff, it's the whole all the fame kind of disappears for a second, and then you look at them, you're having a conversation. It's like conversation with them, and it's like, wow, we were doing the same things when we were kids. Before all these guys became famous, they were doing the same exact things that we were doing. We were just sitting in our living rooms or whatever, just watching horror movies and buying Fangoria magazine and all this kind of stuff. So it's yeah, I mean, there are times when you kind of fanboy out a little bit, and you're like, oh my god, I'm like hanging out here with Kirk Hammett or whoever. But yeah, once they start kind of getting into these stories about when they were kids, it's like, yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. Back in those days, like we were doing the exact same thing. So yeah, it's cool to be able to kind of relate to them on that level. And then after the interviews and stuff, like we're still chatting about stuff. I remember having conversations with Corey Taylor afterwards, about different horror movies, and we're off camera, but we're just hanging out, like sharing this thing that we have in common with each other. So yeah, that was just very cool to kind of break out of that whole issue of fame and stuff. And then now here we are, just dudes, having a conversation about things that we're really passionate about as far as horror goes. So that was very, very cool.
Yeah, and I want to kind of follow this thread because you spoke about how when you're talking with these people and the starstruck feeling wears away, you see that there's a lot that you have in common, that you grew up reading the same things, watching the same things. So I want to ask about you and your journey into loving, appreciating, and following horror, and at the same time, your love and appreciation of metal, where that began. Can you tell us about, your journey into those two worlds?
So horror started first. My dad was a huge horror fan. He was, he grew up with all the classic Universal creatures, and he was a huge Frankenstein fan, Dracula fan. He was a huge fan of the Hammer films. He loved Hammer films. Curse of Frankenstein was probably his favorite of all time. So he kind of got me introduced to horror early on when I was a kid. And I think I pretty much got desensitized very early. I
Yeah.
remember, I remember when I was a kid, maybe 10 years old or something like that. I'd have a birthday party with my friends, and we'd rent a whole bunch of horror films. And I remember watching Elm Street 2 and a whole bunch of other stuff. And yeah, it was like, I remember watching TV and just before I had cable and everything, I'm watching all the kind of censored versions of the horror films, and I just record everything that came on TV. And then Sundays was dollar day at the video store. So every Sunday I'd go to the video store, pick up 5 horror films, every week, and I would just binge and I would just watch all this stuff. And then when I got a little bit older, I was thinking about getting a career in horror to some degree, and I started doing special effects makeup when I was a kid. And of course, Tom Savini and Dick Smith, like those were guys that I idolized, and I, wanted to be kind of like them and get into special effects. So I remember going to horror conventions, the Fangoria conventions in New York when they still had them. I'd go to every single one that I could, and I'd meet these guys that I really looked up to. Um, and then after a while, I kind of got away from the makeup, and I wanted to write and direct a little bit more. So and then here we are, where I'm doing this kind of stuff. So that's where it really started for me as far as horror goes, just very early on being introduced to it. And then as far as metal goes, I was kind of a late bloomer with metal. I wasn't too much into it when I was younger, like in the
Okay.
80s, even into the early 90s. I was like, not a huge fan. Didn't really care for it too much. I was like really focused on horror film soundtracks for some reason.
I
Um,
mean, they're awesome.
yeah, I think the Lost Boys soundtrack was probably like the first, one of the first that I bought, and since then, like I just kept buying soundtracks to all the Elm Street films and everything like that. So I was really focused on that, um, and that kind of introduced me to some metal early on. But really, like uh, my cousin Peter, he introduced me to a lot of metal early on. He was one of those early metal guys. He was all about Megadeth and Metallica and all the stuff back in the day. Later on, I really started to develop an appreciation for the music he was listening to, even though I didn't catch on right away. Like I really started getting
Sure.
into it. He got me into it, over the years. And then in sort of like the mid to late 90s is when I really started getting more into metal, and then it kind of kept going on further after
Okay.
that, where metal really became my favorite genre musically. So then I was like, it was like fully formed, metal and horror uh, together. Came together after a while. So that's kind of how it came about.
Awesome. And as those journeys grow, I mean, when we first start getting into horror and when we first start getting into metal, it's kind of this rush to just absorb as much as we can. Give me, as you say, go to the video store and get just 5, 6, 7 movies that you can binge throughout the week. And when you're listening to metal, just give me all the albums. Let me hear everything. And as we go on, we start refining our tastes. We start really understanding what it is that we love. And with horror, we can figure out the subgenres. I really like supernatural over slasher, or I really like slashers over rape revenge. And with metal, we can start getting into the different kinds of styles that we love. Did you find yourself gravitating towards specific styles of horror movies or specific styles of metal?
Yeah, I think to some degree, with horror, I have an appreciation for a lot of different types of
Yeah.
types of horror. I mean, the slasher films are just fun. I
Yeah.
love the slasher. Just all the different kills. Like that's kind of what you look forward to. Like how crazy they're going to get with Jason's kills in this one.
Yep.
But at the same time, like it's not the most intellectually satisfying. The
Mhm.
slasher films. I do like the supernatural films. I really love films that are kind of take you out of the dimension that you're in, and take you into a different world, like really
Kind of
weird. So I love,
Lovecraftian style
yeah,
horror
I'm
films.
a
Yeah.
really big fan of surrealism as well. I'm a huge David Lynch
Yep.
fan. Love a lot of European surrealism. So any way that can be incorporated into horror, I just love, kind of take you out of this world, to something that's completely different and terrifying in a way because we're not familiar with it. It's the unknown. It's you just don't know really what to expect. Um, but yeah, it's like supernatural stuff is great. Yeah, like there's no, I mean, like torture porn stuff maybe is not my favorite type of thing. I think that
Mhm.
you kind of get to a point where it's like, all right, how many different ways can you just mutilate a person's body, and
Yeah.
where it's not like kind of fun like Friday 13th type of fun, but it's just I don't know. It's just a special kind of taste for for some people. I can appreciate it. Like I loved Hostel, a couple of other films, and I really kind of dug. But after a while, I think it kind of wears. It's type of subgenre that doesn't have a whole lot of life in that sense, and I think we've kind of seen that in a way. Um, but I think there's a place for everything, and I like that filmmakers are experimenting with different subgenres. I think everyone should create what's in their heart and what's in their creativity and see what works, and all of a sudden you create something new, it spawns a whole bunch of other films, and that's something great, and then if it has a short lifespan, then it's fine, you move on to something else. But yeah, I like pretty much everything. Metal a little bit more refined. I still have a strong appreciation for the classic stuff, of course, Metallica, Megadeth,
Yeah.
groups like that, old schoolers. New stuff, like Gojira, Avatar, Ghost, but a lot of different type of things. Black, like really dark black metal. Maybe not my favorite, type of genre, but I have an appreciation for it. Anything that's you know, musicians who really know their instruments and who know how to create something musically, whether I really love it or not, I have a, you know, deep appreciation for what they do.
Yeah.
And even if I'm not necessarily looking for something on Spotify or purchasing a CD or whatever, even if I'm not actively seeking stuff out that I'm listening to on a regular basis, if I'm at a metal show where there's a crap ton of bands performing that maybe I'm not following, like I can still dig it. You know, like I'm still jumping in that mosh pit, and I'm still
Yeah.
feeling the energy of the music. So so I have a different appreciation for these things on different levels. You know, there's some stuff I can listen to in my car or at home, and there's some stuff I can listen to just at a metal show that's just so full of energy. It's just fun, you know, to have
And then
that.
you gotta jump into that wall of death, you know?
Got to, yeah, absolutely. So, so yeah, so I have different appreciations for pretty much everything. You know, anything
Yeah.
that's creative and it really took talent to put together. I think is fantastic, and yeah, and then, but there's certain things that I really kind of look for and focus on.
Amazing. One of the things that you as a filmmaker, when creating a documentary about the history of horror and metal, is that you have to look at the past, at the origins, and kind of how that story has evolved over, in the case of horror, a century, and in the case of metal, over, several decades. And so I'm curious, because of your position and in how you research that and how you got those stories and how you are able to educate all the people who are watching this about that history, did you find yourself thinking about not only the past and how it relates to the present, but also the future? What does the future of horror hold? What does the future of metal hold? And how do those two worlds, in your mind, do you see that they can interact in ways that we haven't seen as of yet?
Um, yeah, I mean, everything's going to keep evolving. I don't think, I mean, horror's not going to end, metal's not going to end. It's just going to keep changing into something different. It's something that I've asked a lot of the people in the film about, like where do they see this going? They pretty much all agree it's going to keep going and it's
Yep.
going to keep evolving, and there are going to be different things going on. But it's also it's hard to say, you know. And I think that if people really knew what the future held, I think they kind of get working on creating whatever that new thing is. You know, I think we're all still trying to figure it out. Um, but the two genres definitely go hand in hand one way or the other. So yeah, it's I don't really know what the future holds, but I think that they're both going to keep going individually, and I think they're going to just keep intersecting along the way in different forms.
Awesome. So I have two more questions, and they're basically mirror images of each other. And I'm not going to put you on the spot with them. So rather than say, what is the most metal horror film of all time, I'm going to ask you, what are some of the greatest metal horror films in your mind?
Oof, wow. um, I mean, a classic, and it's a film that we do cover in the film's Trick or Treat.
Yeah.
Um, that really, and that's one of the early ones, you know, where you had Ozzy and Gene in there. And yeah, it really was, I mean, you know, like a real metal and horror film. I mean, it's a horror film with a massive heavy metal element. You know, the character played by Mark Price, who's also in the film. You know, he plays a metalhead. He's got the posters all over the walls. He's got the T-shirts. I mean, he is like the classic like '80s metalhead that we all know. You know, someone that we all kind of look like, and then have these two major horror stars, and sort of the villain is like this metal rocker, you know, and stuff. Yeah, that was definitely one of them. Um, boy, I think I might need more coffee for this one, but yeah, I mean, like even coming further like into modern times, a film like Get Deathgasm, you know, that's
Yeah.
another one that has a major heavy metal element in horror. Um, yeah, so films like that, and then even just horror films that have metal soundtracks, like the Elm Street films later on started incorporating a lot of metal into them. You know, a lot of the hair bands, especially.
Yeah, that late 90s, early 2000s era when it was
Yeah,
just like how much Slipknot and Cradle of Filth and Hatebreed and
yeah.
Sepultura can you put on the soundtrack of the next Resident Evil movie?
Oh yeah, Queen of the
Yeah.
Damned soundtrack, stuff like that, where you really kind of cram in. It was like that's definitely true. They really try to pack a lot of this kind of metal into the soundtracks. But even like Friday 13th with
Yeah.
Alice Cooper. Yeah, I mean, boy, like even well, I don't know. I mean, maybe if you name a few that maybe I'm missing, but
Oh man, no, no, no. This is where I put you on the spot. You don't put
uh,
me on the spot.
because I know there's going to be some after this, and I'm like, man, why didn't I mention that?
No,
But
I'm looking at my Blu-rays and just, trying to see what immediately jumps out. But yeah, I mean, probably a ton of movies in the 80s. I think you're right that when it comes to a lot of the slashers as they went along, it's interesting. They either went into the metal route or they went into the hip hop route.
yeah,
In films like Halloween Resurrection or House of Wax, there was definitely uh, more of a hip hop element there. But yeah, it's amazing how metal and horror just live and breathe in the exact same world.
yeah, and even
And
well, even the like the Elm Street, I think it was the Elm Street 4 soundtrack had both metal and hip hop
yeah,
together. And I think there were films like that. The filmmakers were trying to bring in these popular musical genres into the films. Obviously metal had a stronger connection in the long run, I think, than hip hop, but it looked like they were really trying to incorporate uh, popular music, not just film score type music, but actual
yeah,
songs, and stuff. And again, like the Lost Boys soundtrack was like another example where,
yeah.
I mean, it's such a classic like soundtrack. Like the songs are so amazing, and and it's not just like a metal soundtrack necessarily, but yeah, they definitely try to bring a lot of stuff in there. Dario Argento brought metal into his earlier films too. So
Yeah.
yeah, there were other filmmakers who I think also felt that early connection with metal. Like it's a dark musical art form. Let's bring that into the movie because it seems to work. And that just continued on from the 80s into today, really.
Yeah, and I think that there were a lot of people who recognized that metal wasn't just a sound, it was also a look. It was a lifestyle, which is where you got stuff like, Return of the Living Dead and Slumber Party Massacre 2, where the either the heroes were punkers, they were outside of the societal norm, or in the case of Slumber Party Massacre 2, the metalhead was the killer with the guitar drill, or the drill guitar, however you want to describe it. But yeah, but no matter what, it all came from a place of fun and rebellion and excitement. Like, no one can watch Slumber Party Massacre 2 and tell me that the guitar drill killer isn't having the time of his life in that role. Like, that is one of the most charismatic horror villains probably ever. I would throw up there. So, we've spoken about a few horror films that are just, some of the greatest uh, metal horror films. But now I'm going to flip this question and I'm going to ask you, what are some metal albums that you think are just, they feel and play out like a horror movie?
Uh, wow. I mean, you get obviously like King Diamond. All of his albums are like horror films. I think Ghost kind of does the same thing. They make their album covers. Like one of their album covers looks like Salem's Lot, right? I mean, that's the look.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Marilyn Manson was just doing major like horror stuff for a while. Really dark stuff on stage. Um, Cradle of Filth, of course. They do a lot of all these guys are just inspired by horror. All that the makeup, the dress, the set design. That's all horror stuff. Slipknot, of course, with their masks. I mean, those are like meant to be disturbing. Horror styled looks. Where they're performing on stage, and it's like this level of brutality on stage with these masks and everything. Yeah, it's there's so many. It's Slayer. I mean, the fire in the background is like you feel like you're in the depths of hell when you're listening to their music, you know, and these huge bursts of flames are just coming up out of the, you know, out of the set. So yeah, I mean, it's there's so many bands that are doing dark things. You know, like I saw Phil Anselmo in the documentary mentions Portal. You know, I wasn't really familiar with Portal prior to the interview, but I looked up some Portal stuff, and I'm like, man, this is really something out of a dark, you know, like awful horror movie, like where you're really like just disturbed. You kind of want to get out of there. It's like so unnerving. You know, when you look at some of the music videos, it's like, oh, man, this is some really like evil looking stuff. Um, but that's part of the fun of it. All these metal bands, they were horror fans, and they want to bring their favorite genre of film on the stage with them, you know, with their entire look and stage show. And they're really putting on almost like a film on stage with all this stuff. So, I mean, so there are just so many examples of metal bands that just bring that to the stage and to the music videos.
Amazing. Mike, thank you so much. The biggest question now, how can people follow you and the history of metal and horror so that they know when it's coming out, how they can show all their friends? Like, what is the best way for them to be informed?
So the website is metalhorror.com, and all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are at the Metal Horror. So everyone can follow us on there. And yeah, we're going to be running the festival circuit for a while, and then see where it goes. Hopefully, you know, hopefully to bigger things after that. But had a blast making this film. Took a couple of years, but that's
Yeah.
kind of what it's all about sometimes. And it's finally done, and just excited to get it out there and to get people to see it. So yeah, it's going to be a fun time.
All right. Thank you so much. And to the Popcorn Frights audience, make sure to enjoy the film and to spread the word.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.